Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Sportscaster Nerd Zone, where sports bridges the gap between the generations. I'm your co-host, Peggy Kaczynski, 12-time Emmy Award-winning sportscaster from ESPN Radio here in Chicago. I'm the mom, I'm the sportscaster, and I'm the baby boomer.
I'm your other co-host, Jason Conander. I'm going to be a senior at the University of Texas at Austin. There I participate in student television. I've also been doing a little blogging on my Substack.
There are times we typically have fun with our show.
Absolutely.
But this is not one of those times. This is one of those episodes where the dynamic of mother and son hosting a podcast really come into play, because it's a topic that we would talk about at home over dinner. We would talk about this before you left for college. We would talk about this before you actually pledged a fraternity. And I'm talking about the shocking and the disturbing hazing scandal that has unfolded at Northwestern University. Head coach Pat Fitzgerald, a star player and coach for 17 years, oversaw a program that, as it turns out, is alleged to have been knee-deep in hazing for quite some time now. Allegations of hazing that included some very disturbing incidences that were sexual in nature as well. And now some brave men and women, former athletes from Northwestern, are coming forward and filing some lawsuits against the university. It's very tough to talk about this, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it really opens up the eyes of everybody to what could be going on in not just college sports, but in all sports across the country. Youth sports, college sports, professional sports. There has been this sort of stigma, this response to this from a small crowd of people that this is very typical hazing, and it might be very typical hazing. And I think that if this is typical hazing, then that's the entire issue. If this is deemed as, not that unordinary by other athletes or, by people who see themselves in these football circles, then that's the issue in of itself. And I think that the way that this is all unraveled at Northwestern has been pretty reflective of this. It started with the football program. It was, just a little Friday news dump where the athletic director tried to, dump off this 2-week suspension for Pat Fitzgerald. And then you see a little domino effect. Some more stories come out. And then the baseball program's involved. And now this week, the volleyball program is involved. And so I think that whole domino effect that we're seeing with Northwestern reveals that it was allegedly institutional failure that allowed this to happen. And I don't think Northwestern is very unique from other schools across the country if this is typical hazing.
Jason's referring to July 7th, when the school announced, while Coach Fitzgerald was basically on vacation for summer break and there was no football activity, that he was suspended 2 weeks for a school's investigation that found hazing allegations by 11 current or former players. The very next day, the student newspaper at Northwestern, the Daily Northwestern, followed up with details of hazing-related activities inside the football locker room and the wrestling locker room at Kenosha, where they would have their what they called Camp Kenosha. And it was their camp before the school year started. And in that, it included forced participation of nudity between quarterback and centers taking a snap, naked pull-ups, something they called the car wash, with offensive linemen being naked, lathering up in soap, and then standing side by side by the showers, the entrance to the showers, while turning round and round like a car wash, so that players would have to rub against them in order to get by. Those were the details that the student newspaper were able to uncover the next day. 2 days later, the university president, Michael Schill, then changed Fitzgerald's suspension to a firing. And as Jason just noted, since then, more and more details keep coming forward. 3 days after that, the university fired the baseball coach, Jim Foster, for bullying and abusive behavior. The university announced yet another investigation to evaluate the school's accountability measures, and the lawsuits have come filing in. I just want to read this, Jason. The state of Illinois does have a hazing law, and not every state does, but the state of Illinois does. And it says a person commits hazing when he or she knowingly requires the performance of an act by a student or other person in school, college, university, or other educational institution for the purpose of induction or admission into any group, organization, or society. If one, the act is not sanctioned or authorized by that educational institution, and two, the act results in bodily harm to any person. The sentence for hazing in the state of Illinois is a Class A misdemeanor, except that hazing that results in death or great bodily harm would be a Class 5 felony. So it is against the law, and you can even look at any college handbook for student handbooks, which I was easily able to find Northwestern's online, and they have a detailed list of hazing, how it is defined, what is not allowed. And so I won't go through all that, but it's interesting to note that the university did admit that hazing did went on. The question is, what did they do about it, if anything, and did they do enough?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like they did a whole lot about it, and I think that the whole, the real story here is holding people accountable. And what we have found out through our research and through the way that the news has unfolded is this is something that's been happening for a very long time. I mean, Pat Fitzgerald is regarded as one of the greatest players in Northwestern football history, and then he joined the staff, and then he became the head coach. And so to think about the years, the decades of involvement that he had in the program, and to think that he was the one that was overlooking all of this, definitely kind of reveals a potential truth that this could have been going on at the school for decades. And to think about the laundry list of victims in that case is just, I mean, it makes you shudder. It's scary. And I'm almost surprised that more states don't have an anti-hazing law, because it seems like something that should be pretty obviously against the law, pretty obviously wrong. And I think another interesting angle of this is the student handbook. The hazing probably refers a little bit more to, or it's probably catered a little bit more to, Greek life organizations. I understand Greek life isn't very big at Northwestern. Other student organizations. I think that people sometimes view the sports, at least the big ones on campus, football and basketball, as like a separate entity from these other clubs, other school-sponsored activities, because they make the money of professional organizations. And so the way that these programs, these athletic programs, now that so many are being dragged into it, so many sports and potentially more schools after this are being dragged into it, the way that everybody is held accountable is going to be the most interesting aspect of the story for me. So that'll definitely be something to keep an eye on as more lawsuits are filed, as these play themselves out in court. Obviously, it's going to be a multi-year process, but seeing the way that everything is tied up at the end will be super interesting for me.
Jason Councils, Patrick Salvi, and Jennifer Cascio are joining us right now to try to help shed some light on a really difficult topic for a lot of people here. Thank you for joining us, both of you. We appreciate it. And maybe, Patrick, if you can help give us the latest. It seems like every day something else is happening with the hazing scandal at Northwestern, and more athletes seem to be coming forward. The most recent, what I believe, is the volleyball accuser at this point.
Yeah, sure. Well, Peggy and Jason, thanks for having us on. Well, what we're really seeing since the announcement of Pat Fitzgerald's suspension and then subsequent firing is that things continue to trickle out. Not just from the football program, but from outside the football program and in other sports. And so, Peggy, you referenced the volleyball player that is now, at the moment, the accurate way to put it procedurally is she's filed her petition to file her case as a Jane Doe that requires court approval, which we're in the process of seeking, but we have the complaint drafted in the form that we expect to file it, and that's been submitted to the court. And so that lawsuit will get going along with the other John Doe lawsuits that we've filed. And of course, there's other firms that have filed cases as well, including some cases for individuals who have not sought to file as John or Jane Doe, such as Mr. Yates. But what we're learning as the investigation and as more information comes out as it all unfolds, because it's rapidly evolving, is that really the feeling we're getting and everything we're hearing suggests that the culture within the university and the athletics department was such that any punishments, if there were any, that's assuming people felt safe enough to come forward and report hazing, abuse, or other acts within the athletic department, including certain acts of sexual violence and sexual harassment and racial discrimination, that to the extent they were willing to come forward, that if anything was done, and it wasn't always that something was done, what would follow would ultimately make it feel like what was done was just checking boxes. So I'll use the volleyball example. Coach Shane Davis, as I understand it, was suspended for a short period of time in the 2021 spring season, which was kind of the makeup for the COVID season. And then they canceled some games. They did anti-hazing training. And then what followed was persistent retaliation in the form of essentially excommunication, where Coach Davis would not talk to this player, would not coach her, and essentially isolated her. And that's hardly how someone who has been hazed, and again, from our client's recount, it was determined to be a hazing incident. That's not how coaches should behave. And if that's how they behave after a hazing incident, then what does the athletic department do? In this case, Dr. Gregg renewed his contract in December, January of 2021, and said very glowing things about him in the press when doing so. And so that entire story, I think, is emblematic of what we see in other programs, as I understand it. Back before 2010, a few years before that, I believe there was a serious issue with the women's soccer team. There's the issue with the cheerleading team that came out a couple of years ago with a lawsuit that was filed alleging sexual misconduct by prominent alumni and folks within the university. We, of course, know about football. Now there's volleyball. The baseball coach was fired. There are so many stories here, and it's not just smoke. There's clearly a fire that needs to be put out.
I wanted to clarify something that I've heard a lot of people talking about this recently, and specifically with the volleyball player, as to why running suicides could be considered hazing. And in this case, jump in if I have this wrong, it was used as punishment for contracting COVID, and she had to run the suicides, which is what we all called them back in the day. They don't call them that anymore. And every time she got to the line, she had to dive like a volleyball player does, had to dive to the line, but she needed to seek medical attention afterwards. She was humiliated doing this in front of the coaches, the training staff, and her teammates. And whereas some people wonder, well, why is this considered hazing? I did look up in the Northwestern University Student Handbook, and it's pretty specific as to what hazing is, and it includes quite a few things, which includes any strenuous physical activity that is expected or inflicted upon another, including calisthenics, physical training as punishment, anything that is physical abuse upon each other. And it does include this with coaching. So at what point, Patrick, are we talking about coaches using something to, I don't know, I guess, motivate an athlete and try to get them to become more disciplined? And when is that stepping over the line and becoming hazing?
I think it steps over the line when the purpose really has nothing to do with conditioning or improving performance, but rather embarrassing, humiliating, and in this case, allowing it to go on to the point of physical injury. And so I think if people, as we're able to tell this story more fully, people will appreciate it better. But in essence, what our client was made to do, run suicides across 3 volleyball courts that has multiple lines. At every line, dive on the ground. And when she would dive on the ground after, and this went on for a very, very long period of time, to the point where, as I understand it from a report that came out from NU, I think it's a website. It's the NU sports.com and Insider. Yeah. Insider. And they had talked to other athletes in the volleyball program that witnessed it, that she was, vomiting, crying. She was bleeding from her elbows, her knees, her wrists, required medical attention, certainly an extremely humiliating, and embarrassing event. And it wasn't an isolated event. Other instances that preceded are described in the complaint. And of course, we don't describe every last shred of evidence in a complaint. That's not how complaints work. And evidence will be gathered throughout litigation, and we expect more to come. And then, of course, the retaliation afterwards. So you really have to look at the whole picture. And when you look at it, this wasn't an effort by a coach to say, we need to be more disciplined, we need to be in better shape, and here's how we're going to do it. That's coaching. This was hazing. This was abuse. And our client in her, at the time, early 20s, a young person who's trying to fit in on the team, get playing time, be accepted. And this is how she's treated by her coach. It's not right, and it needs to be rooted out of the sports culture.
If I can just add one last thing, before Jason, I know, has some questions for you, Jennifer, as well. Patrick, then, the fact that the school, that Northwestern, did open an investigation after the volleyball player complained, was that not enough? Was it not enough what they did or did not do? How does that happen? Like, it's different because it appears that in football, there was no investigations that was opened, but in the volleyball case, she did all the right things, and she opened up a case. There are ways for university athletes where all they have to do is go online and click a little link that says, I have a complaint. She also went to the athletic director as well and complained about, and they did some hazing training. They did some sensitivity type of training with the volleyball program. So was that not enough what the university did in this case?
Well, first of all, it shouldn't happen to begin with. But beyond that, first, I think it's worth pointing out that she didn't personally report this. She sought medical attention, and it was someone who observed her in that setting that reported it because of how concerning it was that a player would arrive in that shape. And, like I imagine, like any medical history, you describe what happened. And so it was reported like that. So it of course, shook someone enough to figure they ought to report it on her behalf. She did later seek out conversation with the athletic director, Dr. Gregg, and as it's described to us, essentially, it was, again, checking boxes without really doing what is necessary to ensure that this isn't part of the Northwestern sports culture. And what I mean by that is, how was there not checking in with our client, checking in with the coach or the coaching staff or the rest of the players after the hazing incident to ensure that which was trained was actually being done? It wasn't. We know it wasn't. And then his contract was renewed in January of the 2021 timeframe, indicating that the athletic department didn't really care that this had happened to our client.
So, Jennifer, I want to get your perspective here a little bit. I thought that Patrick said something really interesting, not in the last question, the question before, when he said that it's clear that this isn't just smoke. There's an actual story here. Do you guys feel like, you have the gist of all of this, that most of the meat of the story is out? Or are you guys anticipating in a way that there's still going to be a good amount of people coming forward, not just from the teams where there have already been accusations, but from teams maybe who haven't been involved yet in the investigation?
Yeah, I mean, based on what we know, I think this is going to expand far beyond football and volleyball. So, the information that we have really does lead us to a well-established conclusion that this spans across genders and sports and time periods as well. The information that we have really leads us to understand that, this predated the football players who have complaints on file. It predated the volleyball player. And this has been really a long-standing institutional issue that really does span decades. And part of that too, a huge problem with that is when you look at this really spanning decades, is there generations of athletes who were promised a safe place. Part of them coming to the university was based upon an inaccurate understanding that they were going to be in a safe place, that they were going to be treated with respect, with dignity, that they were going to have this opportunity to pursue an athletic career, an academic career, in a safe environment. And that was absolutely not the case. And we will see this expand far beyond volleyball and football.
Expanding the picture a little bit more here, something that I'm also curious about is there's been like a little group of people whose response to the allegations has been, oh, well, this doesn't seem like that uncommon from typical hazing. And my response to that is, well, if that's typical hazing, then I would think that other schools would have a very similar issue. Is there sort of that feeling? Is there an anticipation that, we're going to see a little bit of a domino effect with other schools, other athletic programs across the country?
Yeah, I think that is what we're going to see. Without going into specifics, I think that ultimately what we're going to see in the coming weeks and months is that more student athletes from other universities who've experienced very similar things are going to have probably a moment where they say, if this is happening at Northwestern, and if this is something that people are finally having an opportunity to report, they're going to reflect on what they've been through, and they're going to say, this is a problem. This is something that we've experienced at our universities too. We were taught that it was normal. We were taught that it's something we need to deal with. And I think there is going to be a rude awakening amongst universities. I think this is a big problem that's gone on for too long and across the country. And I think that there really are generations of athletes who have been dealing with the trauma of what they went through. And I do think it's going to be kind of a watershed moment for collegiate athletes. And, one of the things that I hope happens, and probably jumping ahead to some of your questions, but what we need to see is we do need to see the NCAA actually start waking up and paying attention to this. They have strict policies on hazing. And one of the issues we're seeing here is a lot of this is the universities keep this in the dark. The university here, Northwestern, came out in response to Jane Doe's complaint and said, yes, we confirmed there was a hazing incident. There was a hazing incident. We deemed it to be hazing in 2021. What were the far-reaching implications of that? Did anything happen? Was there involvement beyond the university, or was there not, because they weren't transparent in reporting that there was a hazing incident at the university?
You bring up a great point. Where is the Big Ten? Where is the conference in this, and where is the NCAA? Have either of you been in any kind of contact with either organization, and why are they not also included in any of the legal actions?
Sure. So we're not in contact with the NCAA or the Big Ten. As of right now, we don't have reason to believe that information stemming from the specific allegations of abuse and hazing that we've heard from Northwestern student athletes got to those institutions. That doesn't mean we aren't going to keep our eye open as to how that exactly works when we're talking about, for example, the hazing incident that was confirmed as a hazing incident of the volleyball player, client of ours, and whether or not the Big Ten or the NCAA ever knew about that or should have. And so we're going to be keeping our eye out, but at this point we're focused on the culture within Northwestern. And I think it bears mentioning that when these folks show up to college as 17, 18, typically year-old kids. I mean, let's I get it. You're 18, you can vote, you can buy cigarettes, you can go to war, but you're a kid. And you show up at college, you show up and you're with these other phenomenal athletes. You want to gain acceptance. You want to play. You want your coach to like you. You want to do what's necessary to be a part of the team. And you haven't had an experience of college athletics. This is your first. And you show up and you're subjected to some of the abhorrent things we heard about the football program. We know within the last year, Coach Foster at the baseball team was fired for bullying and intimidation. We've heard stories about what happened with the cheerleaders. We've heard stories about what happened with the women's soccer team. We've heard personal stories from clients or prospective clients from other sports. And it just breaks my heart that this is like normal, as if in our law firm, if we subjected somebody to something like that could ever fly. And yet we're doing it to kids to win games. That's what we got to end. That's what's got to end.
I don't understand when hazing became sexual. I remember when I was a reporter at NBC5 in Chicago, stories at Lake Zurich High School and Wheaton College. And I think I had a list last week of at least 6 high schools and small colleges in the Chicagoland area who all went through hazing scandals. All of them had sexual overtones. And I thought, isn't this criminal? Isn't it sexual abuse? Is this not just a way of uniting and bringing teams together? But it seems to me that it's criminal as well. Why no criminal charges? Why have there not been any criminal charges filed?
It's a great question. I mean, Illinois specifically. So Illinois has an anti-hazing law. Hazing in general is illegal. It's illegal in Illinois. So even if you're talking about sexual assault, those are crimes. Hazing, if it's deemed to be hazing, that's a crime in Illinois. And I think the unfortunate answer to that is that I think there's a lack of awareness as to how widespread this really is. I think, in my opinion, if you have one well-known incident, you should be looking into the criminal side of it. One victim should be enough. That enough is enough. That should be looked into criminally. But you're right. I mean, it's not. We haven't seen this cross over into the criminal arena. And one problem, as I mentioned, is that I think there's not a good enough view of what the scope of this is. How big is this? How many victims are there? What are the types of things that they're actually going through? But then on top of that, what we're seeing now and what we've seen in the past is when people talk about hazing, there's kind of a visceral reaction. There's a deep divide on how people think about hazing. It's very divisive. It is very divisive. Do I think it's okay? Do I think it should go on anyway? And people have very strong opinions. And I do think, unfortunately, that probably plays a role into the reaction that whether it's prosecutors or politicians, I think there's a real problem in the way that we view hazing. If we think it's part of a sports culture, that's something that we need to get over quickly. We need to move past the fact that this is just part of sports because, there's issues with training. There's issues with coaches being tough. I mean, I was an athlete from a very young age and I was a gymnast, and I can look back and I can think, okay, at 6, maybe should I have had coaches who didn't say X, Y, and Z or weren't pushing me so hard? That's a separate conversation. I never had a situation to where I felt intimidated or in fear for my physical safety. I never had this crossover into a point where the emotional distress was so severe, that it was causing other issues. And I think people just tend to think coaches need to do what coaches need to do for their team to succeed. And if you are not willing to be kind of tough enough, which is what a lot of people think, then maybe this isn't right for you. And we really need to move past that kind of that thought process with sports. And I think there needs to be a real understanding that hazing's a crime. It can have traumatic effects on people for years. It's not the way that student athletes, adult athletes, anyone should be treated. And it's criminal. And on top of that, look, if you want to get into the psychology behind it, if you want people to perform their best, this is not the right way to go about it, beyond the fact that it's criminal and it's abusive. But if the goal is for people to bond and to perform at their highest level, this is the antithesis of how to get to that point.
And I just to echo what you're saying, Jennifer, I had one parent when I was doing an investigation story into hazing. I had one parent tell me, well, boys will be boys. They're 18-year-old boys. And, that's just, what they do. You just got to let that go. But then when we hear, Lloyd Yates say that, there are guys who are having some suicidal thoughts, then that's a problem. That breaks your heart at that point. And that's when I always say parents need to be involved and keep your eyes open and listen and talk to your kids. Jason, much like I talked to you before you went off to college and were going to join a fraternity. And I said, we had a very frank discussion over what kind of hazing might go on in joining a fraternity. And unfortunately, not all parents are having that. And even if you are having the conversation, the kids may still want to be a part of this group so badly, they're going to do anything anyway. So I just wanted to echo that. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah. So my last question, and either of you guys could take this, is, outside of litigation money, what does justice look like for the accusers here? What does, for such a horrible story, such horrible accusations, what does a happy ending, what does justice look like for these people who allegedly went through such horrible abuse and hazing throughout their time at Northwestern?
So, certainly it's a civil lawsuit, and you mentioned the prospect of potentially civil damages, money damages. And to me, that's part of the whole process is, like I always tell my son, if he does something wrong, you got to do a few things. You have to say you're sorry and mean it. You have to see how you can make it right. So how you can fix it. And then you don't do it again. So we haven't really heard an apology. Not sure one's coming, but time will tell. Making it right, fixing it, making up for the harms, that's monetary damages. And then never doing it again, the end of this litigation won't be the last chapter of this story. We talk to people that, despite their experiences, still have this deep love and fondness for Northwestern as a university. And yet they're suing not to destroy its reputation, but actually quite the opposite, to restore its reputation. And so it's going to require Northwestern to take a very serious look at this problem. And I hope every institution does, make sure that their house is clean and ensure that not just the policies and procedures and what you have in place written down on a piece of paper exists. That's important, but that you really mean it and that true consequences exist when they're violated. Not slaps on the wrist, sweep it under the rug, move on, keep it quiet, let's not talk about that anymore. But rather, if something happens, nip that in the bud, do what's necessary to ensure it doesn't happen again, and take it very seriously every single instance. Because if you do that, over time, your culture improves. I think what happened at Northwestern is it was allowed so much over time, and it ultimately became ingrained in the culture in various respects, and sweeping it under the rug became the thing to protect the university brand, that now here we are, where the fabric of reality had previously been stretched to its breaking point, and now it's coming back together. The truth is coming out. People are coming forward, and hopefully that ultimately leads to healing. So I think all of that goes towards helping our clients and others recover from the abuse they've suffered.
I think we do need to point out that Pat Fitzgerald, the football coach who was fired from Northwestern, through his attorney, Dan Webb, has denied the allegations and has denied knowing about it. So I'm curious, are you confident that you can prove that he did know that the hazing was going on, or that he or any assistant coaches actually took part?
I do. I think that when everything unfolds, so in terms of the various stories that so many players have told, the fact that Pat Fitzgerald hasn't only been the coach for the last 17 years, but also was an assistant coach before that and played at Northwestern under Gary Barnett, who very unceremoniously was fired from Colorado because there were significant problems within his program at Colorado. And so I wonder if there's some connectivity in that regard. And so the idea that Pat Fitzgerald would know everything that every coach of a major football university and a Power 5 conference knows about their players, how many calories they're taking, how many bench press, everything, all the minute details that they monitor, that he was unaware of hazing. I find it very hard to believe. And I do know from some clients that some of the hazing took place out on the practice field. It wasn't all in the locker room. And again, I'm not talking about you're not in good enough condition to play, so we need to get you in better condition. I'm talking about things done for the purpose of humiliation, hazing. So public statements are one thing, but how evidence unfolds in a lawsuit through written discovery, emails, other documentation, depositions, that's the evidence. And I do feel confident we'll be able to prove that Pat Fitzgerald knew about a lot of this.
And then my last question is, why are the students that did the hazing not included in these lawsuits? Can you explain that? And I know that Lloyd Yates did address that, saying that maybe they didn't understand what they were doing as much because it was a cultural thing that had been passed down over the years. But could either of you address why not include the students who actually did the hazing as well?
Yeah, it's complicated as to, when we're looking at this kind of culture of allowing hazing to go on, one of the complicated dynamics is, the students who participated in the hazing, more likely than not, were also victims of hazing themselves. And it's kind of a cyclical environment where, unfortunately, we see, there's that statement, hurt people, or the abused become the abusers. And here, what we're focused on is what was allowed by the institution. What were the systemic issues that this athletic department and this institution allowed to go on? So to focus and kind of change the narrative and say, well, this was student-led, or, students participated in it, really takes away from the bigger story here, which really is that the university allowed, condoned, and even promoted, and at points actively engaged in this hazing and perpetuating this culture of hazing. And so to go after students, that most likely were victims themselves is just it's not really part of the bigger issue here. And it's not really our focus. Our focus is, why did the institution allow this for decades? Why were they condoning it, promoting it, and actively participating in it? And what we've really come to hear, and you heard this from Mr. Yates as well, is, those same people who could have participated in this had been abused themselves. Mm-hmm. And so it's really the cycle of abuse that the institution allowed that we're really focusing on here.
Civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who is also involved in some of the litigation, has said that he foresees as many as 30 more lawsuits. And I'm wondering if either of you would comment on, you think that the numbers are going to go up with the number of lawsuits that will be filed in the coming weeks?
Yeah, the number will definitely go up in the coming weeks. How high and how rapidly, I think, remains to be seen, because there still remains a chilling effect. We've talked to a lot of people that really struggle with whether or not they want to go forward with this. Not because they don't feel like they were abused, they do, but because of all the pressures that exist that serve to prevent them, and that have until now served to prevent them from coming forward. And so there's certainly a dynamic here where the football program being called out, that's big news, because it's the football program. That's the most prominent NCAA sport by far when you look at revenue and TV viewing. And so because it is football, that thankfully has provided cover not just for other football players from other sports, and now I think there are a lot of people that played at Northwestern over the years sitting back and thinking, this happened to me, it was wrong, but what are the repercussions if I come forward? Because I feel like I should, but it's hard. And we understand that, and we're trying to work through that with people. And as we do, I do believe that the number of lawsuits will continue to increase. Where exactly it goes, we'll have to wait and see.
Patrick Salvi and Jennifer Cascio, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and to shed some light on, how the whole hazing scandal came to be and where it may be headed. You have your hands full. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy and Jason.
Well, we want to thank our counsels for joining us from the law firm of Salvi, Shostak, and Pritchard, along with co-counsels from the Steiner Law Firm. Parker Steiner was not able to join us, but also Pulaski and Kirker, PLLC as well. They have filed 4 lawsuits so far on behalf of former athletes at Northwestern, football, volleyball, baseball, and softball, regarding the hazing allegations. Jason, I don't think we need to have any predictions in this episode. Pretty serious topic at this point. Let's just hope that prediction-wise and final thought-wise, that people keep their eyes open, say something. If you see something, say something, and think about what you're doing, and don't be afraid to step up.
Absolutely. Well said, Mom.
All right. We want to thank everyone for joining us today as well. Thank you to our counsels, Patrick Salvi and Jennifer Cascio, for joining us. You can check us out on YouTube, and where else, Jason?
Check us out on YouTube, Sportscaster and Son. I think it's actually like the Chicago Sportscaster and Son podcast, but you can find it if you type in our name. Twitter at TSAHS Pod. You can follow me on Twitter at Jason Canander. You can follow my mom on Twitter at Peggy Kaczynski. And if you like our show, please like, rate, and subscribe. Anywhere that you get your audio, you can find us, listen, like, rate, subscribe. Doesn't matter where it is. I promise you it helps us. My favorite place to listen to the show is ESPN Chicago app, but I promise anywhere you get your podcast audio, you can find us.
And thanks to Jake Cantu, who is our producer at the ESPN Chicago app as well. That's where the audio version of the podcast can be found. Thank you all for joining us for this episode. Jason, good job on doing your research for this one and setting up the interviews as well. Let's call this one a wrap and hope that our next episode is something a little bit lighter that we can talk about.
Hey, I don't know, Mom. It's the Chicago White Sox trade deadline.
It's not, I know it's not pretty.
Not to be pretty.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. So long.